I'm Professor Walter Williams at George Mason University, Fairfax, Virginia. My new book, the title is American Contempt for Liberty. And it's a collection of my syndicated columns over a number of years. And I think I have a couple of essays in there. And the thrust of many arguments that I make about today's Americans is that we have a contempt for personal liberty. And why do I say that? What's my evidence? Well, my initial premise is that I own Walter Williams. I am my private property, and you are your private property. Now, when you start off with when your initial premise is self-ownership, then there are certain things that are moral, and there's certain things that are immoral. The reason why murder is immoral is that it violates private property. Rape is immoral. It violates private property. Theft is immoral. It violates private property. So when you start off with, you get your moral grounding, I think, if you start off with the idea of self-ownership. Now, when I say Americans have contempt for these ideas, the average American thinks that it is okay for government to forcibly use one person to serve the purpose of somebody else. Now, one example from our history is slavery, because that's a working definition of slavery. Slavery is the forcible use of one person to serve the purpose of somebody else. Now, we have that in a degree today. That is, when the government takes the earnings of one American and gives those earnings to some other American to whom they do not belong, that indeed is the forcible use of one person to serve the purposes of another. Now, my argument is not against taxes. That is, there are certain mandated constitutional functions of the federal government, and we all are obligated to pay our share. But I don't think that there's any moral obligation whatsoever for the government to take my earnings to give to a farmer, to give to a failing business, to give to poor people for food stamp, to give out as foreign aid, because that's forcibly using me to serve the purposes of somebody else. Now, when I object to the forcible use of one person to serve the purpose of another, I'm not saying that we should not help our fellow man in need, but I am saying that I believe in helping our fellow man in need, and I think that it is praiseworthy and laudable when a person reaches into his own pockets to help one's fellow man in need. But when one reaches in somebody else's pockets to help one's fellow man in need, I think is worthy of condemnation. I think it's no less than theft. And for the Christians among us, when God gave Moses the commandment, thou shalt not steal, he did not mean that thou shalt not steal unless you got a majority vote in Congress. But the average American thinks that whatever you can do to get a majority vote in Congress or at the state legislature is somehow all right. And when I say, just ask yourself the question. James Madison was the acknowledged father of our Constitution. And in 1794, Congress appropriated $15,000 to help some French refugees. James Madison stood on the floor of the House irate, and he said, and I'm virtually quoting him, he said, "I cannot undertake to lay my finger on that article in the Constitution that authorizes Congress to spend the money of their constituents for the purposes of benevolence." Now, if you look at the federal budget, 2/3 to 3/4 of it is for the purposes of benevolence. Now, imagine what the American people would do to any presidential candidate saying the same thing that James Madison said, that you should not take the money of your constituents for the purpose of benevolence. And then he added also that charity is not a legitimate function of government. The average American would run him out of town on the rail. And because the average American thinks that it's okay, if you give a good enough reason, to take what belongs to one American and give it to another American to whom it does not belong. Another example of that is that Suppose I saw an elderly lady sleeping on a grate in downtown Washington, D.C. in the dead of winter. She's hungry. She needs some medical attention, and she needs some shelter. Suppose I walked up suppose I walked up to you with a gun in my hand, and I say, "Give me your $200." Having gotten your $200, I go down and buy the lady some medical attention, some food, and shelter. Would you find me guilty of a crime? Most Americans would find me guilty of a crime, namely theft. But however, here's the problem. Suppose you say, well, suppose the agents of the United States Congress came up to me and says, "Well, Williams, you know that $200 you made last week that you planned to buy a nice bottle of Chateau de Chem Sauterne wine? You will not do that. You will give it to us, and we will go downtown and help the lady out." I assert that there's no distinction between those two acts. Both acts involve taking the rightful property of one person and giving it to another to whom it does not belong. Now, if you press me for a distinction, the only distinction I can find, and it ought to be irrelevant among moral people, is that the first act, where I walked up to you with a gun, that's illegal theft. The second act, when Congress takes your money through its agents at the IRS, that's just legalized theft. It's just a matter of legality. And I think moral people cannot allow legality alone to be their guide, because there are many things in this world that were or are legal but clearly immoral. That is, slavery was legal but clearly immoral. The Nazi persecution of the Jews were legal but clearly immoral. The Stalinist and Maoist purges, they were legal but they were immoral. So we as Americans, or as moral people, we have to ask the question, can you make a moral case for taking what belongs to one American and giving it to another to whom it does not belong? And I don't think you can. And going back to the lady's example, you say, well, I would ask, well, suppose I got two people to agree that I should take your money by force. Would that make it right? What about 3 people? What about 100 people? What about 1 million? What about 300 million? Voted all to take your money to give it to a poor person, it would still be theft, no matter how, no matter whether it's a majority rule or not. Matter of fact, majority rule or democracy gives an aura of legitimacy to acts that would otherwise be immoral. And that's why I would be against, that's why the framers of our nation were against a democracy. They held it in contempt. As a matter of fact, if you look at our founding documents, you don't find the word democracy anywhere, such as the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution.